At first light, the fields are quiet. A thin mist rises over the rolling hills of Gettysburg battlefield. The fences stand as they did more than a century and a half ago. Stone walls stretch across the landscape. The grass bends gently in the morning breeze. It is peaceful now. But this ground once trembled beneath cannon fire. It once carried the cries of wounded men. It once witnessed one of the most profound turning points in American history. Travel south to Antietam National Battlefield, and you find another quiet field. Corn grows there still. A simple white church stands nearby. It is hard to imagine that, in a single day, in September 1862, more Americans fell here than on any other day before or since. These places are silent now, but they remember in the middle of the 19th century. The United States was still a young nation expanding westward, growing in wealth, confident in its promise. Yet beneath that confidence lay a fracture. Two different visions of America were taking shape, one rooted in industrial growth and free labor, the other bound to agriculture and human bondage. For decades, leaders tried to hold the Union together with compromise. Agreements were drafted. Speeches were delivered. Lines were drawn across maps. And yet, the tension did not fade. It deepened in 1858. A lawyer from Illinois stood before a crowd and spoke words that would echo across generations. Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." At the time, those words were a warning. Within 3 years, they would become prophecy. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, something irreversible had begun. What many believed would be a brief conflict, a matter of weeks. Perhaps months would stretch into 4 long, devastating years. More than 600,000 lives would be lost. Families would be divided. Cities would burn. Fields would be scarred. And the very meaning of the United States would be tested. This was not a distant war fought across oceans. It was fought in backyards, along rivers, in towns where neighbors had once shared Sunday dinners. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. Fathers and sons marched in different uniforms. The American Civil War was not simply a clash of armies. It was a struggle over identity, over freedom, power, and the future of a nation still defining itself. And even today, more than 160 years later, its shadow lingers. We see it in the debates over memory and monuments. We hear it in the conversations about equality and states' rights. We feel it in the continuing effort to understand who we are as a people. How did a nation founded on liberty come to wage war against itself? Why did compromise fail? And what did the war ultimately settle? And what did it leave unresolved? To answer those questions, we must step back into a divided America, a country standing at the edge of decision, unaware of the cost that lay ahead, because the story of the Civil War does not begin with cannon smoke rising over Charleston Harbor. It begins years earlier, with quiet arguments, with uneasy alliances, with a nation slowly, almost reluctantly, pulling itself apart. And as we walk these quiet fields today, we are reminded that history does not simply vanish. It waits, it listens, and it asks us to remember. Asterisk. Before the first cannon fired, before uniforms were stitched, and battle lines drawn, before brothers faced one another across open fields, there was an argument. An argument that had been building since the nation's founding. In the early 19th century, the United States was expanding westward at an astonishing pace. New territories opened. New states entered the Union. And with each new addition came a question that grew harder to answer. Would slavery expand with the nation? Or would it be contained? In 1820, Congress attempted its first great balancing act, the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine would enter as a free state. and a line would be drawn across the Louisiana Territory north of that line. Slavery would be prohibited. For a time, it seemed to work. The Union held together, but the compromise was not a solution. It was a pause. As cotton production expanded across the Deep South, slavery became deeply embedded in the Southern economy. Enslaved labor fueled plantations and generated enormous wealth. Southern leaders argued that their agricultural system and their way of life depended upon it. In the North, industrialization was transforming cities. Factories rose. Railroads stretched across states. Immigration swelled the workforce. Slavery, while still present in some places earlier in the century, had largely been abolished there. A different economic model was taking root, one based on wage labor and manufacturing. Two regions, two systems, two increasingly different visions of America. And yet they were bound together under one Constitution. The Constitution itself had never fully resolved the question of slavery. It had sidestepped it, compromised around it, postponed confrontation. The founders, many believed, assumed the institution might gradually fade. Instead, it expanded. By 1850, the nation faced another crisis. The Mexican-American War had added vast new territories to the United States. Once again, the question returned: would these lands permit slavery? The Compromise of 1850 attempted another balancing act. California entered as a free state. Other territories would decide for themselves through popular sovereignty. And a new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners even from free states. That law deeply troubled many in the North, ordinary citizens who had never considered themselves. Activists suddenly found themselves confronted with the reality of slavery. Federal marshals could compel them to assist in the capture of men and women who had fled bondage. Courtrooms became battlegrounds of conscience. It was during this period that abolitionist voices grew louder and more organized. Among the most powerful was Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped slavery himself. Douglass spoke with clarity and force. He reminded audiences that slavery was not an abstract political issue. It was a human one. It was lived daily in chains and separation. In the buying and selling of families, he warned that a nation claiming liberty while permitting slavery was living a contradiction. But in the South, criticism of slavery was increasingly viewed not as moral debate, but as an attack. Southern leaders argued that slavery was protected by the Constitution. Some went further, calling it a positive good. They believed the North neither understood nor respected their social and economic realities, and they feared becoming a permanent minority in Congress as new free states entered the Union. By the mid-1850s, compromise was wearing thin. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It repealed the Missouri Compromise line and allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. The result was not peaceful self-determination. It was violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas. Armed groups formed. Towns were raided. Homes were burned. The territory earned a grim nickname, Bleeding Kansas. What had once been a political disagreement was now drawing blood. Newspapers in both North and South carried alarming reports. Each side accused the other of aggression. Trust eroded. At the same time, the political landscape itself was shifting. Old parties fractured under the strain. The Whig Party collapsed. In its place emerged a new political force, Republican Party founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery into the territories. Its message was not initially one of immediate abolition everywhere. Rather, it was containment. Stop slavery from spreading further west. But in the South, even containment felt like an existential threat, because leaders there understood something critical. If slavery could not expand, it might eventually be surrounded, politically isolated, economically vulnerable, morally condemned. And so suspicion deepened. The Supreme Court's 1857 decision in the Dred Scott case only intensified the divide. The court ruled that African Americans, enslaved or free, were not citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. For many in the North, the decision was stunning. It appeared to open all territories to slavery. It seemed to invalidate decades of compromise. For many in the South, it was validation. Two regions now interpreted the Constitution in profoundly different ways. In Illinois, a lawyer named Abraham Lincoln rose to national attention during debates with Senator Stephen Douglas. Lincoln argued that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. His words were measured. His tone was thoughtful, but his message was unmistakable. The conflict could not be indefinitely postponed. Across the South, those words were heard not as analysis, but as warning. By the end of the 1850s, the Union was still intact. Congress still met. Trains still ran between North and South. Commerce continued, but the spirit of compromise, the fragile glue holding the states together, was cracking. Each election felt more urgent. Each Supreme Court decision more consequential. Each newspaper editorial more accusatory. The divisions were no longer confined to politicians in Washington. They ran through churches, families, and communities. Americans increasingly defined themselves not simply as citizens of the United States, but as Northerners or Southerners. Nation was not yet at war, but it was no longer at peace. And as the presidential election of 1860 approached, many sensed that something decisive was coming. A single ballot, cast in November, would push the country past the point of no return. Because by then, the argument that had simmered for decades over slavery, over power, over the future of the Union was no longer theoretical. It was combustible, and it was about to ignite. Asterisk. By the spring of 1860, the United States felt uneasy. The violence in Kansas had shaken confidence. The Dred Scott decision had unsettled the North. Southern leaders spoke openly about their rights and their fears. Newspapers on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line warned that the coming presidential election might determine the nation's fate. The old political order was collapsing. The Democratic Party, long a national force, fractured along sectional lines. Northern Democrats supported popular sovereignty, the idea that territories could decide the slavery question for themselves. Southern Democrats demanded stronger federal protections for slavery in all territories. They could not agree. Meanwhile, a relatively new political organization, the Republican Party, gathered strength in the North. Its platform was clear: prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. It was not calling, at that moment, for immediate abolition where slavery already existed. But to Southern ears, even limiting expansion was an unacceptable threat. At the center of this political storm stood a tall, reserved lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not the most nationally known figure in 1860. He had lost a Senate race 2 years earlier, but his debates with Stephen Douglas had brought him attention. His words were measured, his tone deliberate. He spoke of preserving the Union while preventing slavery's spread. He did not campaign in the modern sense. Presidential candidates of that era rarely traveled widely. Instead, supporters spoke for him. Newspapers carried his speeches. Pamphlets circulated across northern towns. In the South, however, Lincoln's name stirred alarm. Many Southern leaders believed that a Republican presidency would mean political isolation. They feared that without expansion, slavery would be hemmed in, economically constrained, and morally condemned by a growing majority. Some warned that if Lincoln were elected, secession would follow. It was not an idle threat, when the Democratic Party formally split at its convention in Charleston. South Carolina, the fracture became visible. Southern delegates walked out. 2 Democratic candidates would appear on the ballot, one Northern, one Southern. A 4th candidate, representing a constitutional Union party, sought to calm tensions by focusing simply on preserving the Union. 4 candidates. A divided electorate. On November 6, 1860, Americans cast their votes. Lincoln carried every free state in the North. He won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state to many in the South. The message was unmistakable. A president had been elected with no electoral support from their region. Within weeks, action followed. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to formally secede from the Union. Its declaration argued that the federal government had failed to protect Southern rights, particularly the institution of slavery. Other Deep South states soon followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They did not see themselves as rebels. They believed they were exercising a sovereign right. In February 1861, delegates from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama. There they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War. Davis was experienced, disciplined, and committed to the Southern cause. He believed secession was constitutional. He believed the Confederacy could stand as an independent nation. Yet even as the Confederacy organized itself, President-elect Lincoln remained in Springfield, Illinois, preparing for office. He had not yet taken power. Outgoing President James Buchanan argued that while secession was illegal, he lacked authority to coerce states back into the Union. The country was in a strange, suspended state. 7 states had declared they were no longer part of the United States. But no war had yet begun. In March 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Security was tight. Rumors of assassination circulated. The Capitol itself was surrounded by slave states, its loyalty uncertain. In his inaugural address, Lincoln spoke directly to the South. He assured them he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. But he was firm on one point: the Union was perpetual. No state could lawfully leave it. "We are not enemies," he said, "but friends." His words were calm, his tone conciliatory, but events were already moving beyond speeches. In Charleston Harbor stood Fort Sumter, a federal installation still held by Union troops. Though surrounded by Confederate forces, the fort symbolized unresolved authority. Who controlled federal property within seceded states? Who truly governed? When Lincoln announced that he would send supplies, not weapons, but provisions to the fort's small garrison, Confederate leaders faced a choice: allow resupply and implicitly recognize federal authority. Or act. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. Cannon shells arced across the harbor. Smoke rose against the dawn sky. After 34 hours of bombardment, a Union commander surrendered the fort. No one was killed in the bombardment itself, but something far greater had occurred. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he described as a rebellion. In the upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas's leaders, who had hesitated, now made their decision. They would not send troops against fellow Southerners. They too seceded. The country was now fully divided. Families faced impossible choices. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, loyalties split. In Virginia, one of the most respected officers in the U.S. Army, Robert E. Lee, declined command of Union forces. Though he opposed secession personally, he would not fight against his home state. He resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy. Across the North, men volunteered in large numbers. Bands played, flags waved. Many believed the conflict would be short-lived in the South. Similar scenes unfolded. Communities rallied. Confidence ran high. Leaders spoke of defending liberty and independence. Few imagined how long or how devastating the struggle would become. The election of 1860 had not created the nation's divisions, but it had forced them into the open. Compromise had failed. Words had given way to artillery. A house divided had begun to collapse, and as volunteers boarded trains and marched beneath bright spring skies, neither side yet understood the scale of what lay ahead. The first great battle would soon shatter any remaining illusions, and the war, once begun, would demand more than anyone was prepared to give. In the summer of 1861, there was still a sense on both sides that this war might be brief. Young men filled recruitment offices. Bands played patriotic songs in town squares. Uniforms were stitched in haste. Mothers and wives stood proudly beside departing sons, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Neither the Union nor the Confederacy yet understood what modern warfare would demand. Washington, D.C., sat nervously just across the Potomac River from Virginia, now part of the Confederacy. The capital felt exposed. President Abraham Lincoln faced enormous pressure to act quickly. Newspapers called for decisive action. Citizens demanded a victory. So in July of 1861, Union forces marched south toward a small railroad junction near Manassas, Virginia. What followed would become known as the First Battle of Bull Run. On a warm July morning, thousands of Union troops advanced, expecting to scatter what they assumed were poorly organized Confederate forces. Some civilians from Washington even traveled out with picnic baskets, hoping to witness a swift and glorious triumph. Instead, they witnessed chaos. The fighting was fierce and disorganized. Commands were misunderstood. Units became separated. The sound of musket fire and artillery thunder rolled across the fields. Smoke thickened in the summer heat. Confederate forces held firm. A relatively unknown Southern general, Thomas Jackson, earned a nickname that day. Standing resolute as shells exploded around him, he was said to resemble a stone wall. The name stayed with him. Stonewall Jackson. As the afternoon wore on, Union lines began to buckle. What started as an orderly retreat quickly turned into a panicked flight back toward Washington. Wagons overturned. Civilians scrambled to escape. Soldiers dropped rifles as they ran. The illusion of a short war vanished in a single afternoon. Both sides had suffered casualties far greater than Americans were accustomed to seeing. Families scanning newspaper lists for names realized that this would not be a brief campaign of glory. It would be a long, punishing struggle. The months that followed revealed the scale of the challenge. The Union possessed advantages in population, industry, railroads, and naval power. The Confederacy had strong military leadership, interior lines of communication, and the fierce motivation of defending home soil. And gradually, key figures emerged. In the West, a quiet, determined officer began to distinguish himself. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was not flamboyant. He did not deliver soaring speeches, but he possessed something rare and unyielding resolve. At Fort Donelson in early 1862, when Confederate forces asked for terms, Grant replied that he would accept only unconditional and immediate surrender. The North celebrated. At last, a victory. Meanwhile, in the East, the Confederacy placed its trust in Robert E. Lee. Lee was composed, deeply religious, and respected by his men. He believed in aggressive tactics and bold maneuvering. Though often outnumbered, he took calculated risks, striking quickly and unexpectedly. The war was expanding geographically and emotionally. In April 1862, Union and Confederate armies clashed at Shiloh in Tennessee. The battle lasted 2 days. When it ended, nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The numbers stunned the nation. Americans had never seen such carnage, and this was only the beginning. In September 1862, Lee led his army north into Maryland. He hoped a victory on Union soil might encourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy and perhaps persuade border states to join the Southern cause. Union forces intercepted him near a quiet creek called Antietam. The battle that followed would become the bloodiest single day in American history. When it ended, more than 22,000 men lay dead or wounded. Cornfields were trampled. A sunken road became a trench of bodies. A narrow stone bridge was stained with blood. The scale of suffering was undeniable. Photography, still a relatively new technology, brought images of the fallen into northern homes. For the first time, civilians saw the reality of battlefield death, not as heroic paintings, but as stark, unfiltered scenes. The war was no longer romantic. It was personal. Behind every casualty number was a name, a family, a letter half-written. Hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked without modern anesthesia or antiseptics. Limbs were amputated to prevent infection. The cries of the wounded filled makeshift wards. And yet, despite the horror, neither side was prepared to abandon its cause. For the Union, preserving the nation became a sacred objective. For the Confederacy, independence was framed as a matter of honor and survival. President Lincoln watched these developments with growing seriousness. He understood that military victories alone would not define the war's meaning. Something deeper was at stake. But in 1862, that larger transformation had not yet fully unfolded. At this stage, the conflict was still primarily about Union versus secession. The deeper moral reckoning over slavery itself was approaching. The first year of war had stripped away illusions. It had revealed both courage and suffering on a scale Americans had never known, and it had made one fact unmistakably clear. This would not be settled quickly. As winter settled over camps from Virginia to Tennessee, soldiers huddled around campfires, uncertain how long they would be gone. Some would never return. The war was growing larger, bloodier, more complicated. And the decisions made in the coming months would transform it from a battle over Union into a struggle over freedom itself, because the next turning point would change not only the direction of the war, but the very definition of what the United States stood for. By late summer of 1862, the war had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. The optimism of 1861 was gone. In its place stood a grim awareness. This conflict would not end with a single decisive clash. It would grind forward, testing endurance, leadership, and conviction. In September 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee carried the war north. His army crossed into Maryland, hoping to shift the momentum. A victory on Union soil might strengthen Southern morale. It might even persuade Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. The two armies met near Sharpsburg, along a narrow stream called Antietam Creek. The Battle of Antietam began at dawn on September 17. By sunset, more than 22,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. The fighting surged back and forth across farmland and cornfields. Soldiers clashed in a sunken country road that would later be known simply as Bloody Lane. At a stone bridge over the creek, Union troops struggled to dislodge determined Confederate defenders. There was no sweeping victory, no triumphant parade, But Lee's invasion was halted. He retreated back to Virginia. For President Abraham Lincoln, the outcome was enough. For months, Lincoln had been waiting for a military success, something that would give him the political footing to take a bold step. 5 days after Antietam, he issued a preliminary announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, it would take effect. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be forever free. It did not immediately free every enslaved person in America. It applied specifically to Confederate-controlled territories. But its impact was profound. The war was no longer solely about preserving the Union. It was now openly about ending slavery. This shift altered the moral dimension of the conflict. It made foreign recognition of the Confederacy far less likely. European powers, having abolished slavery themselves, were hesitant to support a government fighting to preserve it. It also opened the door for African American men to enlist in the Union Army. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 black soldiers would serve in Union uniform, fighting not only for the nation, but for their own freedom. Still, in early 1863, the outcome of the war remained uncertain. Lee's army continued to fight with determination and skill. In the spring, he achieved another victory at Chancellorsville, though at terrible cost. His trusted commander, Stonewall Jackson, was accidentally shot by his own men and later died of his wounds. Lee chose once again to move north. In June 1863, Confederate forces crossed into Pennsylvania. Farms and towns braced for confrontation. The two armies collided near a small crossroads town, Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg would last 3 days. On July 1st, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town, but Union soldiers regrouped on higher ground south of Gettysburg. On July 2nd, fierce fighting erupted at places that would become etched into American memory: Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Ridge. On July 3rd, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault across open fields toward the center of the Union line. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers advanced in a formation that would later be known as Pickett's Charge. Union artillery tore through their ranks. When it was over, the assault had failed. Lee's army began its retreat back to Virginia. Gettysburg marked a decisive turning point. The Confederacy would never again mount a major invasion of the North, but the victory came at staggering cost. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The town itself became a vast hospital. Churches, homes, barns all filled with the wounded. In November 1863, President Lincoln returned to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. His speech was brief, just over 2 minutes, yet the Gettysburg Address would become one of the most enduring statements in American history. Lincoln spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He framed the war as a test whether such a nation could endure. Did not dwell on strategy or politics. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of unfinished work, and he called on the living to ensure that those who died shall not have died in vain. Even after Gettysburg, however, the war did not end. Far from it. In the West, Union forces under General Grant tightened their grip on the Mississippi River. The fall of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, one day after Pickett's Charge, gave the Union full control of the river, splitting the Confederacy in two. Momentum was shifting, but wars are not decided by single victories alone. They are decided by endurance. The Confederacy still had armies in the field. It still had leaders determined to resist. Southern civilians, despite shortages and hardship, continued to support the cause. The Union, too, faced challenges. War weariness set in. Casualty lists grew longer. Draft riots erupted in New York City in 1863, revealing deep tensions within the North. The nation remained divided, not just geographically, but emotionally. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Emancipation Proclamation had reshaped the war's purpose. Gettysburg had demonstrated that the Confederacy could be turned back. And Lincoln's words had redefined the meaning of the struggle. This was no longer simply a fight to restore what had been. It was a fight to create something new. A union without slavery, a nation more closely aligned with its founding ideals. Achieving that vision would require still more sacrifice. The war had entered a new phase, harder, more relentless, and as 1864 approached, the final chapters of this conflict would demand everything the country had left to give. By 1864, the American Civil War had entered a new and grimmer phase. The early optimism was long gone. So too was any belief that the conflict could be limited to soldiers alone. Entire regions were now bound to the war's outcome. Farms, railroads, factories, and households had become part of the struggle. This was no longer simply a contest of armies. It was a test of endurance. In the spring of 1864, President Abraham Lincoln placed overall command of Union forces in the hands of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant understood something essential. The Confederacy could not be defeated through a single brilliant maneuver. Its armies had to be engaged continuously, stretched thin, and worn down. Grant would pursue General Robert E. Lee relentlessly in Virginia. At the same time, other Union forces would press in the West. The fighting that followed was brutal. In the wilderness of Virginia, dense forest caught fire as artillery shells ignited dry underbrush. Wounded men, unable to move, were consumed by flames. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, soldiers fought for hours in pouring rain at what became known as the Bloody Angle, locked in combat so intense that rifle stocks splintered and trees were cut down by musket fire. Grant absorbed staggering casualties. Yet he did not retreat. Each time Lee's army fell back, Grant followed. It was a new kind of war, one of attrition. The Union's larger population and industrial capacity gave it an advantage in such a contest. But the human cost was terrible. In the West, another Union commander prepared to make his mark, William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman believed that to end the war, the Confederacy's ability to wage it had to be destroyed, not only its armies, but its infrastructure. In September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, a vital railroad hub. The fall of the city delivered a significant blow to Southern morale and boosted Lincoln's chances for re-election. But Sherman's campaign did not end there. In November, he began what would become known as the March to the Sea. His troops cut a wide path through Georgia, moving from Atlanta to Savannah. Railroads were torn up, warehouses burned, crops were destroyed. The objective was clear: break the Confederacy's capacity and will to continue fighting. For civilians in the path of Sherman's army, the march was devastating. Homes were abandoned. Livelihoods vanished in smoke. Sherman defended his strategy as necessary to shorten the war. To many Southerners, it felt like a deliberate assault on their way of life. Meanwhile, life behind the lines north and south grew increasingly strained. In the Confederacy, shortages became severe. The Union blockade limited trade. Inflation soared. Basic goods became scarce. Women stood in bread lines. Some staged protests, demanding food for their families. Southern men were away at the front. Women managed farms, ran businesses, and held households together under mounting pressure. In the North, industrial production surged. Factories produced weapons, uniforms, and supplies. Railroads transported troops and material at unprecedented speed. Yet the war was not Universally popular. In 1863, resistance to the draft erupted into violence in New York City. Riots broke out. Buildings were burned. African American citizens were targeted in mob attacks. The unrest revealed deep divisions within Northern society. There were those who questioned Lincoln's leadership. Some argued that the war had gone too far. Others objected to emancipation. Political opponents called for negotiation with the Confederacy. The election of 1864 became a referendum on the war itself. Lincoln's opponent, George McClellan, a former Union general, advocated for a negotiated peace. War weariness was real. Casualty lists continued to lengthen, but Sherman's capture of Atlanta shifted public sentiment. Lincoln won re-election. The decision signaled that the North was prepared to continue the fight until the Union was restored. At the same time, the war was transforming American society in lasting ways. The Emancipation Proclamation had opened the door for African American soldiers. By 1864, black regiments were fighting with distinction. They faced not only the dangers of combat, but the threat of harsher treatment if captured. Their participation reinforced the war's evolving purpose. No longer was it only about preserving a political union. It was about redefining freedom itself. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. It still required ratification by the states, but its passage marked a profound shift. The institution that had divided the nation for generations was nearing its legal end. Yet on the battlefields, the fighting continued. In Virginia, Grant's forces laid siege to Petersburg, a crucial supply center for Lee's army. Trenches stretched for miles. Conditions were grim: mud, disease, exhaustion. The war had taken on a modern shape, foreshadowing conflicts of the 20th century. For civilians, letters from the front carried both hope and dread. Telegraph lines transmitted news quickly, sometimes too quickly. Communities gathered outside newspaper offices, waiting for updates. Church bells tolled for the fallen. Cemeteries expanded. By early 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Supplies dwindled. Rail lines were broken. Desertions increased. Yet even in hardship, resolve lingered. For 4 years, Americans had endured unimaginable strain. Now, the end was approaching, but it would not arrive without one final reckoning. The strategy of total war had pushed the Confederacy to the brink, but the question remained: how would it conclude? Would the nation find reconciliation? Or would victory bring only deeper wounds? As winter turned toward spring in 1865, the armies in Virginia prepared for the final movements of a war that had reshaped the United States forever. The long struggle was nearly over, but its consequences were only beginning. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was running out of time. For nearly 10 months, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant had pinned down General Robert E. Lee around Petersburg, Virginia. The siege stretched mile after mile: trenches, earthworks, artillery placements. Soldiers on both sides endured cold rain, hunger, and constant tension. Richmond, the Confederate capital, stood just a few miles away. Supplies into the city had dwindled. Rail lines were cut. Food was scarce. Desertions increased. The Southern government could see what was coming, though few were willing to say it aloud. On April 2, 1865, Union forces broke through Confederate lines at Petersburg. Lee had no choice. That night, Richmond was evacuated. Confederate officials set fire to warehouses and government buildings to prevent them from falling into Union hands. Flames spread beyond control. By morning, large sections of the city were burning. The next day, Union troops entered Richmond. President Abraham Lincoln visited the fallen Confederate capital shortly afterward. He walked its streets quietly, without grand ceremony. Freed African Americans gathered around him, some kneeling, some weeping. Lincoln urged them to stand. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a leader hoping for restoration. Meanwhile, Lee's army retreated westward. His men were exhausted. Many had not eaten properly in days. They marched in worn uniforms, boots split at the seams, rifles slung over thin shoulders. Lee hoped to reach supplies in Lynchburg, Virginia, or perhaps link up with other Confederate forces. But Union troops moved quickly. Grant pursued without hesitation. By April 8th, Union cavalry had blocked the road at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. Lee knew the situation was dire. On the morning of April 9, 1865, he agreed to meet Grant to discuss surrender. The meeting took place in the parlor of a modest home owned by Wilmer McLean, a man who, by coincidence, had once lived near the first battle of Bull Run. It was said that the war had begun in his front yard and would now end in his parlor. Lee arrived first, dressed in a clean gray uniform, his sword at his side. Though weary, he carried himself with dignity. Grant arrived shortly afterward, his uniform dusty from travel. The two men had known each other briefly during the Mexican-American War. Though not closely, their conversation began with small talk recollections of earlier service. Then, they turned to the matter at hand. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers would keep their sidearms. Soldiers would be allowed to return home with their horses, many of which were needed for spring planting. All who surrendered would be paroled, promising not to take up arms again and would not be prosecuted for treason. Lee accepted. When the papers were signed, the Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist as a fighting force. Outside, Union soldiers began to celebrate, but Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." It was a quiet, restrained moment. There were no grand speeches on the field, no dramatic surrender ceremony with thousands assembled. Just two generals in a small room, ending 4 years of unimaginable conflict. Over the next several days, Confederate troops laid down their arms. Stacks of rifles were piled high. Flags were furled. Men who had marched through blood-soaked fields now turned toward home, many unsure what awaited them there. Other Confederate armies soon followed suit. General Joseph Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina. Smaller forces disbanded across the South. The war, at last, was ending. More than 600,000 Americans were dead. Some modern estimates suggest even higher numbers. Entire communities had been altered forever. Nearly every family, North and South, had felt loss. Railroads were destroyed. Farms were ravaged. Cities lay in ruin. And yet, as the guns fell silent, a fragile hope emerged. Perhaps reconciliation was possible. In Washington, President Lincoln began outlining his vision for Reconstruction. He spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all. He believed the South should be restored to the Union with as little bitterness as possible. He understood that the work ahead would be difficult. 4 million formerly enslaved people were now free. The legal and social structures of Southern society had been upended. Political rights, citizenship, and representation all required careful rebuilding. The war had preserved the Union, but peace would require something more. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. That evening, he was shot by an assassin. The nation was stunned. In a moment when unity seemed within reach, tragedy struck again. Lincoln died the next morning. His death cast a shadow over the fragile peace. The man who had guided the Union through its darkest hour would not live to shape its recovery. As his funeral train traveled across the country, Americans gathered along the tracks, north and south, mourning the loss. The war had ended, but the work of healing had only begun. At Appomattox, there had been dignity. There had been restraint. There had been the possibility of reconciliation. Yet the deeper wounds of the conflict over race, power, memory, and justice would not disappear overnight. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse marked the end of armed rebellion. It did not mark the end of struggle. The nation stood at a crossroads once more. It had survived division. Now it had to decide what kind of union it would become, and whether the sacrifices made on so many battlefields would lead to lasting unity or simply to a different kind of conflict. When the guns fell silent in the spring of 1865, Americans faced a question as daunting as any battle. What now? The Union had been preserved. The Confederacy had surrendered. Slavery through the 13th Amendment was abolished, but 4 million formerly enslaved men, women, and children now stood at the threshold of freedom in a country unprepared for what that freedom would mean. The physical destruction across the South was immense. Railroads lay twisted and broken. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta bore scars of fire. Farms were abandoned or stripped bare, and yet the deeper reconstruction would not be measured in bricks and timber. It would be measured in rights, power, and identity. President Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a measured and forgiving restoration. He spoke of malice toward none and charity for all. His plan for Reconstruction called for relatively lenient terms. If 10% of a Southern state's voters pledged loyalty to the Union, it could re-establish its government. Lincoln believed that healing required restraint, but Lincoln was gone. After his assassination, the presidency passed to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, who had remained loyal to the Union. Johnson favored rapid restoration of Southern states. He issued pardons to many former Confederate leaders and allowed states to reorganize with limited federal oversight. In many Southern legislatures, former Confederates quickly returned to positions of authority. And almost immediately, new laws began to appear known as Black Codes. These laws restricted the movement, employment, and civil rights of African Americans. They sought to maintain a racial hierarchy as close to slavery as possible, short of chains. In the North, many members of Congress were alarmed. They believed that without stronger federal protection, the sacrifices of the war would be undermined. A struggle emerged between President Johnson and Congress. At stake was the very definition of freedom. Congressional Republicans often called. Radical Republicans pushed for sweeping reforms. They sought to guarantee citizenship and equal protection under the law for formerly enslaved people. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. Soon after, it proposed the 14th Amendment. The amendment declared that anyone born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen and entitled to equal protection under the law. This was a profound shift. Before the war, citizenship had been ambiguously defined. Now, the Constitution itself affirmed national citizenship and equal rights. Later, the 15th Amendment would prohibit denying the right to vote based on race. On paper, the transformation was extraordinary, but on the ground, reality proved far more complicated. Federal troops remained stationed in the South during Reconstruction, enforcing new laws and protecting black voters. For a time, African Americans participated actively in politics. They voted. They served in state legislatures. Some were elected to Congress. For a brief moment, a new Southern political order seemed possible. Public schools expanded. Infrastructure was rebuilt. Institutions such as the Freedmen's Bureau provided assistance helping to establish schools, negotiate labor contracts, and reunite families separated by slavery. Yet resistance was fierce. white supremacist organizations emerged, most notably the Ku Klux Klan. Through intimidation, violence, and terror, they sought to restore white dominance and suppress black political participation. Night riders burned homes and churches. Lynching spread fear across communities. The federal government responded at times with enforcement, acts designed to curb such violence. But public commitment in the North began to waver. Reconstruction required sustained political will and sustained attention. As the 1870s progressed, Northern voters grew weary. Economic concerns, including a severe financial panic in 1873, diverted focus. Many Americans wanted to move beyond the war and its aftermath. In 1877, a disputed presidential election led to a political compromise. Federal troops were withdrawn from the remaining southern states. Reconstruction effectively ended without federal enforcement. Many of the gains made by African Americans eroded. Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws, establishing racial segregation and disenfranchising black citizens for generations. The promise of equal protection remained in the Constitution, but its fulfillment was delayed. The Civil War had abolished slavery. It had preserved the Union, but it had not resolved all the divisions. It exposed. Memory itself became contested ground. In the South, the lost cause narrative took shape, portraying the Confederate struggle as noble and minimizing the role of slavery as a central cause of the war. Monuments were erected. Veterans groups organized commemorations. In the North, remembrance often focused on Union victory and national unity. Over time, reconciliation between white Northerners and white Southerners advanced, but frequently at the expense of African American rights. The war's legacy remained complex. Cemeteries filled with white headstones stood as solemn reminders of sacrifice. Places like Gettysburg National Military Park became sacred ground sites of reflection and remembrance. Yet the deeper questions lingered. What did freedom truly mean? What did equality require? Could a nation once divided by slavery fully transcend its past? The American Civil War had reshaped the Constitution. It had redefined citizenship. It had expanded federal authority and clarified the permanence of the Union. But it had also revealed how fragile progress could be. For decades after Reconstruction, the struggle for civil rights continued. The amendments passed in the aftermath of the war would serve as legal foundations for future generations that would challenge segregation and demand the promises of the Constitution be honored. In that sense, the Civil War did not end in 1865. Its consequences unfolded across the 20th century and into our own time. A nation had been reborn through fire, yet whether it was fully healed remained an open question. The war tested whether a republic dedicated to liberty could survive its own contradictions. It survived, but survival is not the same as resolution. We look back across those battlefields, across those years of sacrifice and struggle. We are reminded that history is not distant. It shapes institutions. It shapes memory. It shapes identity. The Civil War defined the United States in ways both visible and subtle, and its echoes remain quiet, persistent, and sometimes unresolved, because a house once divided can be rebuilt, but the marks of its fracture never entirely disappear. As the sun begins to set over the rolling hills of Gettysburg National Military Park, the light softens. Long shadows stretch across the fields. The cannons are silent now. The fences have been rebuilt. The grass grows thick where soldiers once stood in fear and determination. It is peaceful here. And yet, this ground holds memory. Across the South, at places like Appomattox Courthouse, the story of surrender and reconciliation lingers in quiet rooms and preserved walls. Visitors walk slowly through these spaces, reading plaques, studying artifacts, imagining the weight of those final days. The Civil War was the greatest trial the United States has ever endured. It tested whether a republic founded on liberty could survive its own contradictions. It forced Americans to confront the distance between their ideals and their reality. More than 600,000 lives were lost. Families were reshaped. Entire regions were transformed. But from that devastation emerged a changed nation. Slavery, an institution embedded at the nation's founding, was abolished. The Constitution was amended to define citizenship and promise equal protection under the law. The Union, once fragile and uncertain, was declared permanent. And yet, the war's legacy is not simple. Its consequences unfolded over generations. Its promises were unevenly fulfilled. Its memories were interpreted in different ways, sometimes uniting, sometimes dividing. Perhaps that is the enduring mystery of the American Civil War. It ended with surrender papers, signed in a quiet Virginia parlor, but its meaning continues to unfold. President Abraham Lincoln once asked whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. It did endure, but not without cost. As we stand on these preserved battlefields today, we are not only remembering the past, we are reflecting on the kind of country those sacrifices made possible. A more unified nation, a more expansive definition of freedom, a union strengthened by fire. The echoes of that divided house still reach us through our institutions, our debates, our shared history. And perhaps the final lesson is this: nations, like people, are tested not only by their triumphs, but by their trials. The American Civil War was such a trial, and in remembering it, we honor not only those who fought, but the enduring effort to build a more perfect union.